Okay. Yeah. So I figure what we can do. One thing that I wanted to do is go through kind of like a hey, we learned some things. We played Ironsworn a bit. I figure like we've learned some stuff.
Hmm.
Um, we know what works well. We know what's problematic. I did want to do like a postmortem almost, just from
Okay.
a player and GM perspective of
Hmm.
here's what we think. And then one of the big ones that I had in mind, I don't call it a gripe for the game, but it's 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 gonna come up when we talk about it. But it's like not having a really firm idea in mind coming in of kind of like an arc that you want to go in.
Mm.
While it's not bad, it feels like having one would be better.
Yeah.
Because it feels
Yeah.
like it
I
can be a
felt
little
like we kind of
aimless.
floundered there for a
Yeah.
little while
Mm-hmm.
in like out of the way places
Mm-hmm.
that we didn't expect to be.
Yeah, I mean, and I thought it was great. I had a really good time with it. I thought it took us in
Mhm.
really interesting places, but I feel
The
like
manatee
yeah, the manatee. I mean, that's gold. That is gold. It was
is
so
gold.
I would not trade anything for losing out on that manatee. It was so good,
Mm.
you know. But I feel like it was just it was isolated in its own. Like it doesn't feel like the manatee, you know, fit into the overall theme that we were going with. We're kind of bouncing around all over the place. So we'll start with this. So what worked well? I'm curious to get your thoughts from Ironsworn. We've played it a few times now, co-op.
Mhm.
What do you think works well for it?
It works well.
Mm-hmm. In
I
your
mean,
mind?
I think it really works well as like a no GM game
Mm-hmm.
because I felt like we were both playing it on equal terms.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, I loved having the oracles.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you don't have to come up with something like all the time. If you have some sort of inspiration, you can go with it. If not, you can roll and then just
Mm-hmm.
build off of that. That
Yep.
was actually really fun,
Yep.
which is interesting because I thought, like, when I first saw the Oracle stuff, I was thinking, like, oh man, this is going to be really horrible. Like, if we keep having to do that, then it's just going to be boring. But it wasn't boring at all.
No, no, it's not. Yeah, I agree with you
No.
on that one. Mm-hmm.
The the Iron Vows were interesting, and I think that was one thing that I didn't understand at first, but
Mm-hmm.
definitely after the second session, I understood them a little bit better, and I wish I would have done more.
Yeah.
Uh, but I like the combat and how they do the I forget what they call it, like
Oh,
your
like
arcs,
the oh, you like
small little arcs, huh?
the small arcs.
Arcs. So like when we went into combat and one of
Mm-hmm.
us had to keep track of it,
Mm-hmm.
and then you get to a certain point and then you can roll against it.
Mm-hmm. To see if you close it out
Yeah,
or how the
I
fight ends. Yeah.
I enjoyed that as a mechanic.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. I thought it was interesting. So we had a few. I wouldn't necessarily say lengthy fights, but we had a few fights in there that I felt were good. What we had three big ones. It wasn't the manatee fight, but it was some fights that were around the manatee.
Hmm.
We had we had Shield Bro and the dudes, Shield Bro and the dudes,
Yep.
and then we also had the
For the
really
Chimera.
nasty one, the chimeras. Yeah, that one
Yeah.
was pretty brutal. Uh, and I thought the chimera one stood out especially because we stacked up all these things, we did all this stuff. We built up all this progress. We had like 9 progress, and then you rolled box cars. You rolled double tens on the challenge die, and the game was like, nope, sorry, you lose. Figure it out. Which I liked. I thought that was cool. I mean, that turned it into a thing
Yeah.
where before it was gonna be like a blip. That was a road bump. That was a speed bump before that happened.
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
like that because even though you're doing well or you think you're doing
Mm-hmm.
well, it's not a guaranteed that you're going to win the fight, which is
No.
more realistic.
Yeah. Yeah, it can certainly make it frustrating, but not in a bad way. Frustrating, like, you know, like, I thought we had this thing, but then it's like, twist of fate. No, it's actually this other thing. So that was cool.
You're not done. Do something more.
That's right. Reset it, make it worse, make it terrible, which is cool. Like, and that was actually, I think, interesting too. I can see how folks can have a hard time with a game where the game a lot of times will put you in this really rough spot of, you know, in the narrative, you're kind of getting the sense of, yeah, like, okay, it's good. You know, I'm going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. Everything makes sense. And then the game will say, no, you advance from 4 to J. And you're like, oh, okay. Well, now what? And so, you know, and that's where the oracles, I think, could be really handy too, because then you can just roll on some stuff and get an idea of like, oh yeah, we can do this. Like, that's cool. Yeah. The other thing about combat too, that from reading the rules, it's a little easier when somebody explains it to you. But in reading the rules the first time, I thought that combat, and I did this when I did my solo game, all the combat that I did was all like strikes and clashes and things like that. But you don't have to. Like, the game, the rules tell you should be using all these other moves too, like trying to secure an advantage or facing danger and gathering information, and it makes sense. Like, it makes sense after you've done that. You're like, oh, of course, why wouldn't you? But the game isn't necessarily like right up front telling you, or maybe doesn't do a good job as was originally thought when I first read through it. But when I played through it, it feels good because it's like not all combat has to be, I'm going to attack him. Like, sometimes, like for our manatee thing that we were doing, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to move over here. Well, I'm going to set up a good position. Okay, I'm going to get ready to accept a charge. I'm going to come over here and do this thing. And I think you had the same thing when we were fighting Shield Bro. You had like, there was a bunch of stuff you were doing that wasn't even like fighting related before you even, and then it was like one strike and it was over, which was crazy.
Oops.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a little too pent up with rage, I guess, because it cracked him like a nut.
That's right. It worked out great. Yeah. So, how about anything else that worked well for you that comes to mind?
I think like the world building was really nice, because we started out definitely knowing, you know, where we were and what was going on around us, even if we didn't know specifically what we were doing.
Yeah.
And I think we had enough like hooks as far as places and people that we eventually were able to get somewhere.
Yep. Yeah, I think world building was really cool the way they did it. I've read a bunch of other people's stuff for how they came up with their world building, and it's even though it's using the same core questions, it seems like whenever I read somebody else doing something and they'll say, oh, but I want it to be like this, and I read it and I go, oh, that's cool. Like, it's a little twist that you had. Even sometimes just the simple things like, you know, the iron pillar things. I've seen a couple where people will go, oh, I want it to be like this. It's this thing. It's like, oh, that's actually really cool. Which was pretty nifty. So I did like that. The one thing that and this kind of goes into the, you know, things that could be better. So I don't want to spend too much time on it yet, but I feel like it might do well to have some world building questions that maybe flesh out your inciting event a little bit more. You know, in the world building, they give you a lot of prompts, like for all the questions to say, oh, and this can be like an inciting event thing that you can do. But then the game does this really cool thing and it says, hey, your character has this inciting event. And that's what's interesting. Like, yeah, world events. Yeah, sure. Whatever. That's cool and all. But like for your character, what's your cool thing? I feel like there could be some questions there, like not just world building questions, but also like a character story question you can throw on the end there, which could be cool. So, yeah. Anything else? Is there any other thunder you want to steal before I say anything that I think is interesting?
Nothing comes to mind.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm on board with pretty much everything you said. Yeah, all those things. I thought it flowed really well. At first, I was concerned about about all the moves that it was going to be too much to keep in mind
Mm-hmm.
or to keep track of, and it wasn't. What else? I like how mean the game can be, which is good. I mean, not just in like throwing twists at you. That's a mean that I really like too. From all the weak hits and the misses, the game it's built to be mean, which is awesome. But also the mechanics too. Like the game will just, if you take liberties, the game just beats you up, and it just says, I'm just gonna ruin you, and you're gonna have to deal with it, which I like, which is cool. Because you don't have the GM. You know, the GM is the one who's there not to beat you up, but but sometimes to say, hey, you're doing some stupid stuff, and I'm gonna thump you for it, so you can see, hey, that was maybe look, I'm gonna show you that was stupid. And I was worried that this game wouldn't have that, but it does, which is good. So, and it drops it on you a lot. Anything else I really liked about the system and the mechanics? No, I think we covered most of it. How about our game that we did? What was your favorite part from our game, as part of, not just like from a story perspective, but how it ended up working out with this game in particular, with Ironsworn in particular?
The manatee.
The manatee.
Yes, that whole, I don't know, scenario scene, that was just gold. That was so fun to play, and I don't know, it definitely changed the game for us. I think
it did.
It had been like had a certain mood before then, and then as soon as we had the great manatee, then it kind of lightened up a little bit.
It did. It did, and then it got serious again at the end. I mean, in a silly way, but still, after what my favorite part about that whole sequence, maybe a little different than yours, or maybe you're thinking about it in the same way too, is at the end it was that whole thing of like, oh, now I want to bond with the manatee. Like I want this manatee to be a bond of mine. Like I want to connect with it. And when you started talking about it, I was like, it's gonna be a throwaway thing. Like, yeah, no big deal. Like, cool, yeah, you get a manatee bud, and then we're going to be on our way. And then the manatee spurned you because you rolled really bad, which was hysterical, which like it just brought on even more. And that was a whole element of like you took a vow to like take vengeance on the town that sent things after. Like that was awesome. I loved that. That was so good.
Definitely ran with it.
That's right. And that was pretty cool. Yeah, I liked how easy it was to flesh out the world with the questions. So one of the big reasons that I like Apocalypse World so much is not just because of the system. Actually, the reason that I like Apocalypse World so much is because of the playbooks and the way that they design the playbooks. Not with the powers and the abilities and all this stuff, but the game right up front says, hey, you have all this cool stuff, or pick these cool things, and there are these interesting things that your character has. And there's all these questions that are just seeded right into that. They're just right into the thing you pick without you having to come up with anything. There's all of this content that's there, that's just begging to be asked, how did you get this thing? Tell me about that, which then builds out the world, in a really simple way. It can be something as simple as, oh, I have this big suit of armor. Like, where did you get that from? What does it look like? What is it? Because now you're, and that's all setting. Like you're telling us about cool things, and I love that because many games that even run on Apocalypse World system don't do that as effectively. Like we played Scum and Villainy, did it a little bit, but not a lot. Like it has your friends that are on there. That's like probably the coolest theme and setting thing that's on the character sheets for Scum and Villainy is your people, and what they do. But that's not it doesn't have the depth to it. Blades has it a little bit, but not all the way. And then I saw the character sheets for this, and I thought, like it has a little bit, like in the skills you pick, but not really, like the assets you pick, but not really. But it has all those questions baked into the world building. When you ask all those questions up front, and then as you're creating your character, that all comes into the mix because you
Yeah.
start thinking like, hey, how does it tie into that? And like we did the whole thing with the Iron Bengal Queen and all this stuff, and it's like I love that. That's so good because it just seeds it for you, which I love. And that it for me it made it feel like our game, even though we spent all of what like 20 minutes just going through the questionnaire sheet for the world building.
It
Uh,
was more than that.
it was a little bit. I mean, with that combined with our characters, it was all kind of together. That's it's funny you mention that. I don't think we really spent a lot of time going through the questions, but I feel like we spent a lot of time once we got into our characters because then we referenced a lot of things that were from the world building, and that was
Yeah.
almost like part 2 of world building. It was let's put our characters in this, and then let's ask a lot of questions
Hmm.
about things that are around that. And I thought that was great. I really liked that about our game. It made it feel like it was a little more fleshed out, even though there was really a total blank slate, nothing really there to
Yeah.
begin with. So
I definitely went into the play feeling like I knew who my character was and how
mm-hmm.
she might act. Whereas, yeah, but like with Scum and Villainy, I didn't necessarily get that feeling
Mm-hmm.
from the character sheet and what I'd filled out there and the questions that it had.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, no, like Apocalypse Worlds, I definitely know who my characters are when I
Oh
start
yeah.
those.
Yeah, you know who your character are, who your characters are. You know how they fit in the world. You know the stuff that's immediately around you. By the time you're done with the first session, you have a sense of where you're lived in. Because it puts it all right there, which is so cool. And this comes close to that, which is as far as I'm concerned, that's high praise. So cool. What do you think did not work well? And we're actually going to put this in terms of our experience playing the game during our co-op play. So what do you think was either didn't work well or was problematic or had you going or didn't flow as well as you liked?
I think just getting started, like
Mm.
figuring out what exactly we were doing
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning and where we were going and how even our characters interacted. Like I knew who
Mm-hmm.
my character was, you knew who your character was,
Mm-hmm.
but the connection between them wasn't that strong.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, I think, a little difficult. And even
Yeah.
once we got going and we had the dude man shield bro fight, we were still kind of wandering and we wound up in like the town that we spent forever in, and it wasn't until we started like actually heading towards a specific place
Mm-hmm.
that it felt like we were actually getting anywhere.
Yeah, it may have been a little challenging too because we had established in our characters up front that it was almost, I don't want to say adversarial, but it was almost adversarial because your character was trying to do her thing and you'd set her up to be this independent, do her own thing character. And then, and also who had maybe not the best dealings with this other major NPC that we identified. And then my character's like, no, I work for that NPC and I want to bring you in. So like immediately it's like, oh, cool. Just go right from the beginning. Let's go right there. And then we threw in other things that made that a little more challenging too, which I think actually worked out better because then, that gave us a reason to connect. But your concern, the issue that you ran into, the challenge you ran into of trying to figure out how our characters went together and then the thing we were doing, like we each had our own like individual thing, and none of them really came in at all. Like yours was, your long-term thing was you wanted to find out your people, and then you had this whole NPC with one of the firstborn, and then I had this thing with the magic and with my character's wife and all this stuff, and that never came in at all. Like it was just, it turned into nothing. We didn't get anywhere near it.
We barely got anywhere.
Yeah, we really didn't get much of anywhere. Like we were trying to go after, your friend. And it wasn't even like a really big one either. Like we were just trying to even just do that. And it felt, I don't want to say it felt aimless because it didn't feel aimless. It felt like we kept getting stuck in the side quests. And I don't mean that in a bad way because because that's where the game was. Like it felt like we were on, one of like the Star Trek seasons that has an arcing story, but then every episode you get stuck doing like, oh, I got to do this thing, like, oh, stuck doing this thing, and then you make like a little bit of progress maybe, and the next episode comes in, you're like, oh, I found this gas station, I have to deal with the robots and the alien guys, like, and then at the end you're like, oh, I learned this little thing, maybe if I'm lucky. So it wasn't a bad thing, but it felt disconnected. It really felt disconnected.
I kind of wonder if that might become better or easier the more you play it. Like if you figure out the best way to seed those kinds of things within your world and characters. It'd be interesting to find out.
So it's almost like I paid you to throw that in there. So my it's well done. So my big thing, and the reason why I wanted to put a pin in this one to say, hey, this was like I felt like that was a good learning game. It was a great learning game that we went through. Mm-hmm. We were both learning the system. You were at a disadvantage because you were learning the system without any of the books. You had to rely on me, which is never a good thing ever. And you had no reference materials, which makes it difficult. So I felt like it was a good stopping point. Also, the other big thing that I realized is, like we talked about earlier, is I feel like this is a game where if you want to do the what's the movie with the show with David Carradine, The Wandering, you know what I'm talking about, the Wandering Ninja,
Badlands?
The what's that?
Badlands? Into the Badlands?
I don't think it's into the. It was a TV show, The Wandering something. Anyways, it was like the Wandering Fighter Monk, Kung Fu legend, whatever, and he wanders around and he has adventures.
Perhaps I'm too young for that one.
It was. David Carradine was much younger, and David Carradine he's not young.
I know him from that. Oh, the movie.
He was in Kill Bill.
Yeah.
So it's his.
But there's an earlier movie.
Oh yeah, there's a bunch of movies. Yeah. And then you can go like real old, and then you can go like when he was a kid, and he was in this movie called King of the Emperor of the North Pole with Ernest Borgnine and Lee Ermey, and he had to be all of maybe 22 years old. David Carradine.
Wow.
And Lee Marvin and Ernest Borgnine, I think, have always been like 50 years old. So, so that tells you how old they were in the movie too. Anyways, we digress. But I think a challenge we ran into is that with a game like this, and not just I don't think we would run into, but I think anybody would run into, is that if you come in and you just say inciting incident, like here's something from my background, here's the thing, and then you roll into the game and you're just like, oh, let me see where the game takes me, then I think the game is going to take you on an adventure. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're coming in and you just want to be the wandering hero who does the whatever or experiences the whatever wandering stories of whodunitness, then this game is going to deliver for you. Like it's got your back. With the oracles and everything, it's going to take you on a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. You're getting Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. But you know what? It sure as hell feels disconnected sometimes. Like it feels like that you're on a roller coaster and that you maybe don't have as much control over things as you want. And I don't think it's not to say that's a bad thing, but it feels like the general, like a theme of a story, that it would be better served by coming in and saying like, hey, I'm okay with going where the river takes me, Pocahontas style. But I feel like having a really strong sense of, but here's the kind of an arc I want. Like here's the kind of a narrative that I want to experience. And I don't care how I get there or where it takes me, but like I want the general direction to be something like this. And then I think having that sense of where you want things to go, like in a general direction of where you want them to go, could be helpful, because then as things come up, you can still come up with wild and wacky things that take you all over the place, but you can at least put it in a direction that feels like, yeah, and it's flowing in a place where I want it to go. Does that make sense?
Yes.
No.
So having, I don't know, not necessarily an idea of exactly what you want your characters to do, but kind of the experience that you want them to have. So I'm thinking of like, you go into it thinking, you know, I have this character who's really like antisocial and doesn't want to, you know, do anything with people, but I want something that happens that opens them up and makes them change.
Yeah, yeah, and some kind of theme there too. Like maybe you'll say, and I want this to be, you know, more social in nature. I want it to be a discovery of, you know, self by meeting people on a similar journey, or something as simple as, you know, I want to be the wandering paladin that gets put in situations that I want to be the good guy and I want to help, but then I keep getting stuck in gray area, you know, or, you know, but having that kind of a theme that you just put up front and say, this is the kind of story I want to have. You don't prescribe how it's going to go. You don't have to dictate where the end is going to take you, but, you know, but at least, you know, like it's when you read the back of the book, you know, you don't know how the book's going to end, but you have a sense of what this book is about. And I feel like Ironsworn, without that back of the book, like without writing the back of the book before you start Ironsworn, you're on a roller coaster ride and you don't know where the track is taking you. And that's not a bad thing if that's what you're signing on for. But if you don't, it can feel really disconnected. It can, yeah. At least that's my experience so far. As I drink some more.
Yeah.
So, cool. Well, that was a decent little postmortem. Anything you want to throw in there, or you think big lessons learned that you want to keep or change for next time? Any big nuggets? Solid 5 out of 7.
I think one of the things that worked well for both of our characters was tying our abilities into our characters, like not just their presence, but like their past.
Yeah.
So like I had the hammer that had my great grandmother's spirit in it, and you had, you know, the experience with your wife and how that went wrong. But that's all kind of tied to what our characters were, and I don't know that I necessarily have had that in any other like character creations before. That's always come like after. Yeah. Like, oh, I've created this wonderful character, and this is what they're like, and this is what they look like, and then it's the, oh, but how do you interact with people, or where are those connections? Whereas it felt like we were building those while we were building the characters.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that, and where those things came about was that was a product of us working through the world building first before we had our characters, which I think was smart, because then it gives us some canvas to work off of to know where to fit things in. But it was also the oracles. So all those, like our bonds and stuff, originally we said, hey, instead of just coming up with this is exactly what it is, let's roll for it. And we used the oracles, and we came up with some really quirky stuff, which turned out to be really cool. And then so, we, you know, like we've played enough Apocalypse World style games to know, and Sorcerer to know, cross that shit like right off the bat. Just do it.
Yeah. Well, and I find that for me particularly, when I'm given constraints, so like, you know, the oracles would give you things to work with, but you have to work within those. I find it's easier to be creative. Like, okay, I have this and this, let's make this work.
Yeah.
Whatever weird possible way we can.
Yeah, it gives you a seed instead of just like, be funny.
Yeah.
It's like, oh.
Tell a joke right now.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, let me see. Are there any nuggets that I would leave from our game? I thought this is something we did well, and we've gotten feedback on it. And this is a way that we already play as it is. But I think Ironsworn in general, and the way we played the game and it worked well, is done best with building. So, you know, we would both willingly acknowledge all the stuff that we were throwing in, good, bad, and otherwise, and just ran with it. and that made it flow really well, but it also makes it really go in some unexpected directions, and yeah, and I dug that. So I feel like in some games that works really well. In most games that works really well, but in this one, I think it's critical. I think you have to do it.
So you played it solo. So how was the difference between playing it solo and having to come up with stories and stuff versus playing it with someone else and having them throw in things as well?
It was interesting. I really enjoyed it. I felt like I had so the concern that I had in this one, where I felt like we didn't have a good solid theme, like a cohesive theme to go on. In
Mm.
that game, it's really interesting to mention this. I hadn't thought about this before. In the solo game, I had a very strong idea of what I wanted the game to look like and how I want it to flow. And I only played through like 2 or 3 sessions, and I had a great time with it. And it felt like I always knew how things were progressing. I felt like I always had a good attachment to how things were going. So thank you for asking me that question, because that tells me that my thoughts on having a good strong theme in mind of how I want it to go, like, that felt awesome. The difference in having a co-op experience versus a single player experience is that solo, I only have me. So there were a number of times in our co-op in our game that we played where I would throw out some ideas, because we'd roll on, like, Shield Bro and Dudes was a great example of this.
Mm-hmm.
We rolled on the Oracle. Something came up, like, they brought out like an asset or a thing or a weapon, and my mind went to, like, oh, they brought like a net or a heavy weapon or a something to neutralize you, and you're like, no, they brought in an actual professional warrior. And and I remember I was like, oh, that's great. Let's do that. That's awesome. I'm never gonna say no, period. But there were moments in there where, like, I would come up with an idea and, like, ooh, this could be cool. But then somebody else is like, ooh, but what about this? Like, oh, that's awesome. Oh, I like that. That's great. Yeah, we should do that.
Somebody else.
Yeah. So having, and it's just kind of a silly thing, but and a silly obvious thing, but having more ideas at the table is always better, which is why I much prefer playing this game with multiple people. Not to mention it's an experience you can share with somebody else, but having somebody else who's not you and having other ideas that are not from your brain are
Yeah.
great, especially people with different experiences, different backgrounds, different feelings on gaming and how things should go. That's
Mm-hmm.
cool, because then it throws in interesting stuff that you wouldn't have thought of, which is cool, which is awesome.
Diversity increases creativity.
Woohoo!
Woo!
So yeah, no, that was good. I'm glad you asked that question. That was I hadn't thought about my solo experience compared to this. So that confirmed, study confirmed. We've done an independent confirmation of the study that having a theme up front is important. Cool. Okay, so so this takes us to where we want to go from here. So